Sveiki visi susirinkusi.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is so nice to see you, those who are not tired of today's discussions and willing to debate more and take part in the discussion on disinformation as a tool for dividing society. I would like to give the floor to the ambassador of Norway to make welcome remarks.
So much. So, dear friends, dear participants, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. The late American politician and social scientist Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said. Once, this was a widely accepted principle. Today, this may no longer be the case. Terms like post-truth and alternative facts reflect a shift in how we engage with reality. This shift presents a range of complex challenges and difficult dilemmas. How do we share and process information when trust in experts and established media is eroding, perhaps beyond repair? Why do we increasingly favor narratives that confirm our biases? And how do we respond to and navigate the social sphere where information can be and is used against us as individuals, against our institutions, and increasingly against our basic democratic procedures? Disinformation has become a powerful weapon for authoritarian regimes, extremist groups, and populist movements. These actors deliberately spread false or misleading information to undermine trust in democratic institutions, to polarize societies, to influence public opinion for political gain. Lithuania and Norway have experienced this firsthand. Malign actors spread fear and division by promoting Russia's narratives and distorting issues like migration or LGBTQI+ rights. Another shared example is the targeted campaign against Norway's child right protection system, active in many countries, including Lithuania some years back. Information manipulation and interference is central to hybrid warfare. It spreads faster than ever through the use of deepfakes and AI-driven amplification. And by exploiting our cognitive biases, state actors can achieve strategic effects in targeted audiences. The sophistication of these operations demands urgent, coordinated responses as we work to strengthen democratic resilience. To be clear, disinformation threatens human rights by targeting vulnerable groups with hateful narratives, by undermining freedom of expression and creating mistrust that hinders informed democratic participation. Norway collaborates with allies to bolster resilience. One of the major tools at our disposal are the EEA and Norway grants designed to strengthen civil society, to promote democratic governance and enhance human rights. Through the grants, Norway has for 2 decades supported Lithuania's institutions and resilience in the face of threats. Our efforts continue. In November, we launched the new EEA Civil Society Fund to reinforce democracy, human rights, and the rule of law across Europe. As we start negotiations on the upcoming priorities in Lithuania, fortifying resilience is central to our efforts. We will continue using the EEA and Norway grants to support democratic processes, to build public trust in institutions, and to empower NGOs to combat polarization driven by disinformation. At a security conference this morning, I listened to the scholar Franz Stefan Gadi, who, when talking about hybrid warfare, said, quote, "Russia is attempting to divide Europe. They will be testing us." And in the face of such weaponized disinformation, the antidote lies in fostering open conversations, grounded in media literacy and critical thinking. Through dialogue, we can bridge divides and restore shared senses of reality. Mark Twain thought the most useful and interesting information came from children because, quote, they tell all they know and then they stop. I will take his advice now and stop. Thank you for your attention.
Dėkoju ambasadoriui už tokią puikią mūsų diskusijos įžangą.
Thank you, Ambassador, for a wonderful introduction into our debate. Today we'll be talking of a weapon of disinformation in the digital area. Is there room for dialogue? So we'll be searching, looking for ways to find dialogue in our digital area. So let me briefly introduce today's participants of the debate. Dr. Viktor Denisenko from Vilnius University, Donatas Puslys from the Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis, Professor Dr. Kristina Juraitė, presenting Vytautas Magnus University, and Colonel Lieutenant Thomas Bolkus. So since we are pressed for time, let me ask you right away, what have your recent efforts in the fight against disinformation have been? And please briefly introduce yourself as well. Well, as far as I understand, I have to say that I have been in charge of another communications faculty, one that is dedicated to fighting propaganda and research of propaganda. So I have been into the research of into propaganda and disinformation for the past 18 years. I have been doing this since my study years, and I've done this as a scientist. A lot of research has been done by myself. Let me just inform you on the book I published in 2023 on propaganda, where I looked into propaganda through the historical and contemporary angles. Well, Viktor has written the book, and I myself am trying to implement the content of the book in practice. I'm mainly a teacher, and my main task is to communicate with the younger audience on disinformation, who tends to narrow down or limit this issue to Russians in general. And so it's very difficult to convince people that Google should not be your only source of information. So this kind of dialogue with the people is very important. As a former radio host, I find this kind of communication and search for dialogue as a very important tool. With our colleagues back then, we used to conduct certain analysis through animation when it comes to the spread of disinformation, but I will delve deeper into that at a later point. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to sit next to those who are working with our younger generation, and I'm also able to share some similar experience. I am a lecturer at Vytautas Magnus University. I'm also a scientist. My connection with the topic relates to the topic of prevention of disinformation, and my efforts in the field have been lasting ones. I have been working for many years in the field. I used to work on media, on the sociology of media, and my PhD paper was also related to the topic, which is even relevant today, as we are living in the era of the media, of digital culture. which changes a lot for us. It changes our communication, for one. And the search for dialogue communication is now a priority for us. What we lost through digital communication was the gift of community, sense of community, understanding, mutual understanding. But I believe we will look into that in today's debate. Good evening. My name is Thomas. I represent the military. And the military is not only fighting with conventional lethal arms, but also with communication. We are forced to defend from communication as well. They say you can win if you win. If you lose the battle in your minds, will be forced to withstand the tanks of the enemy. So the military has been active in the communication field for quite some time now. Our main goal is to understand and analyze the information field of the enemy, its effect on our society, and the decision-making processes of the enemy. We try to issue recommendations how to better understand our information space and not to digress into the direction aspired by our enemy. So Donatas, let's start with you, since you have already made a certain introduction into the use of the media in search for information or disinformation. The opposition between information and disinformation is ages old. It began since the beginnings of communication per se. So what has changed with the introduction of technologies and the digital era? How did the information space change? Well, I believe I will not surprise anyone by saying, first and foremost, that we've now entered into the era of too much information as opposed to the era of too little information that we used to live in before. Confirmation bias is something that we are dealing with nowadays. You can therefore find confirmation to the most idiotic presumptions. It is said that we tend to subconsciously search for certain answers, even though we have certain predispositions. We are searching for ways to confirm things that we already have a certain understanding. And if I try to resist certain things, if I ask myself whether or not I have to believe in certain things, I will find reasons how to deny one or other fact. So whenever you have to work with young people, I believe it is very important to start from ways of thinking, ways of functioning, ways of selecting a good source of information from the bad one. Communicating about ways of forms of disinformation. Disinformation is also part of a certain identity. You can be either a liberal, a fighter for certain rights. So disinformation is also a tool in maintaining certain identities and certain images. It is a broad topic in general. So I've started with certain irony that it is important to speak about security and hybrid attacks from Russia in general, but we should not limit this discussion to that alone. It's a much wider topic. If you go into discussion about the distinction between science and pseudoscience, you can always resort to, let's say, cosmetics that is science-backed that you should buy. But do we actually analyze the science behind certain cosmetics products? So that's where disinformation begins, from those simpler things. Thomas, based on your practice, does the number of challenges related to disinformation increase? Well, I would have to say that the number of those challenges will never go down. Whenever there's a new instrument introduced, it raises more challenges. Let's say with the emergence of AI, more challenges have emerged. So yes, we will face more challenges in the future, but this does not mean anything bad. I think we could draw parallels with vaccination. Let's say, do we have enough vaccines in our bodies to resist certain diseases? So the same could apply to disinformation. Some 12, 13 years ago, we didn't have such forums like the ones we have today, and we did not speak openly about the influence of Russia, about the problem of disinformation, whereas now we do delve into these discussions. So despite the increase of these challenges, the situation does not deteriorate in general, because we are discussing these issues. We take the time to, let's say, flick through certain web pages in order to learn how to deal with certain issues. Well, pre-bunking techniques are probably very important when it comes to tackling disinformation, because fighting disinformation is also an effort in vaccinating, so to say, our society against disinformation. Now, we've mentioned today that social media and the constant bombardment with not necessarily qualitative information contributes to the effectiveness of the weapons of disinformation that we're talking about today. So, Kristina, to you as an expert in ideological communication, does our social media still have room for qualitative discussion, and how can we not get lost in this a huge flow of information? Because whenever we look at our social media and certain profiles, if we filter out certain bots and trolls, we see that there are very few people remaining in those groups engaged in qualitative debate. Well, technologies, rapidly developing technologies, is a challenge for us as, in order to see how much resistant to them we are and capable of absorbing those technologies, and how capable we are to use the technologies properly. Because we have to admit that a lot of information is coming not only from the outside, we are also involved in the spread of certain disinformation. We might be handy tools for certain disinformation strategies. There is a lot of research and quite conflicting research. Into social communication, social media, and how it affects society at large. There's a very clear social polarization that exists on social media. There are certain communication clusters that exist. There are certain algorithms on social media, and these are some very technologically difficult questions that require certain answers. And we must find ways how to respond to the existing algorithms on social media. We have to make sure that social media is accountable to us as consumers of social media. And as a sociologist, I had to look into the statistics on the users of social media. As Digital 2024 quote, 78% of the Lithuanian residents are users of social media. And if we look into Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and YouTube, the most popular social media, by the way, and their users, but X, or former Twitter, is also announcing that 45% of its users, 45% Lithuanians use the social network. We have to resort to these statistics limitedly because we are not fully aware how this statistics is compiled. But these figures also raise some concern, demonstrating that these social networks contain a lot of information, a lot of fake profiles as well. And so the responsibility and accountability and transparency of social media networks is very important in this respect. So perhaps the Digital Media Act that speaks of accountability and transparency of social media is very important. Now, Viktor, I turn to you. Since you are communicating a lot with the youngsters, do you think the Lithuanian society is quite resilient and capable of selecting the information? Because we tend to hear that Lithuanians do not feel very strong in the fight against disinformation. So are we actually capable of grasping the manipulation of our bigger neighbor?
This is a very complicated issue and question. There's a positive stereotype that in Lithuania we debate on that a lot. We are experts. We know Russia very well, that we get all those narratives from Russia mostly, and therefore we are resilient. But if we look into that in more detail, the picture is not that positive. Different methodologies lead to different results. In recent years, I have seen that we have 50-50 evaluation of the resilience of our society. It is a positive evaluation in the EU, on the EU level, but recently there was a European study which showed that Lithuanians are among those that do not tend to check information. Why is it so? Maybe we are convinced that we are good at recognizing information, trustworthy information. It means that there are some logical gaps in people's thinking. For example, if you ask people, do you face unreliable information? And they are starting to list everything, including social media. And I have a logical question. Why do you use or consume the social media if you believe that the information is untrustworthy? Another question is, are you able to recognize untrustworthy information? And the answer is yes, I'm critical, I'm able to do that. And question number 3 is, could you provide concrete examples when you face untrustworthy information? And for example, the person gives that there's a spread of false news and untrustworthy information, but is not able to give any specific examples. It means that we talk a lot about this, but we cannot refer to this as absolute resilience. Thomas would like to react. You mentioned 50-50 ratio. Well, this does not mean that 50% of information of people are resilient and 50% of the population are unresilient. But we can check the spread of certain Russian and Belarusian narratives and the spread in our society. And the results are very similar in 2 years. From 10 to 15% of the population tend to believe the narratives or micro-narratives spread by Russia or Belarus. But let us look at our national, at the composition of our population in terms of national belonging. About 70% of the population, according to our study, does not believe in those narratives. Earlier studies showed that only 30% agreed that there was a certain information war from Russia going on in 2012. Now we have 60 to 70% ratio of people believing of information warfare coming from Russia. Well, this percentage can range within the limits of 10%, but I do not believe that it is highly effective. I do not want to disagree with Viktoras, but I just wanted to explain the numbers in order to avoid misinformation, because misinformation is not disinformation. Is some people might think by hearing 50 on 50 that 50% believe in disinformation, and this results in misinformation in our conversation. Thomas, can I reply or react? I think we should not trust statistics only, because statistics is also a type of lie. Information space is full of possibilities of using different information channels, and sometimes we might get lost and fail to see the diversity, and the diversity is really very wide. And Thomas's remark on our young people being very skeptical towards literacy, I think that the same could be said about our students, university students. They say that they are well aware of everything. So our task is to build a dialogue with a young person who has certain experience in information channels. Thomas, we've mentioned that those opinion polls very much depend on what type of group you interview. Which social groups are most vulnerable to disinformation, in your opinion? As journalists, we often ask ourselves whether we are able to inoculate people against disinformation, especially those that do not have the necessary immunity. Because we can really reach those that have immunity, but it's not very easy to reach those that do not have immunity. My answer will not be very scientific. Older people are more susceptible to some types of information because they cannot check it, but young people do not always tend to search for certain things, but they are more resistible because they can check different other channels in order to verify the information. For example, my daughter and son, where little they discuss certain facts, and my son would ask, "What are your arguments?" He was a first grader, and the daughter was in the kindergarten. And I was surprised by that. Well, when I was in the first grade, I wouldn't ask such questions. So it means that we have improved in this respect. This means that the younger generation is less susceptible to things that can be easily checked. And the older generation that finds a new channel is not always able to check this channel or to verify this channel. Well, my answer is not very detailed. Well, I think that the older generation is more susceptible, but when we speak about the threat, we're speaking about future expectations. And older generations tend to discuss it in a different way because young people do not have experience in that. Older generations know about the Soviet Union, and young people do not feel this past in the Soviet Union. They have no experience in that. They don't have this understanding, and it's easier to manipulate on this topic with them. And it is very easy to divert the issue while communicating with them. Donate, do you have any other remarks on young people being more intelligent and asking for arguments? Well, I'm always very hopeful. We should always be hopeful. Young people do care about arguments, but if we have different positions, how do we present those arguments? When we speak about Russian disinformation, we have a very narrow understanding of that. Different statistics or some false news saying that the Soviet times were more prosperous. But we use three levels to analyze this information. So what is the aggressor? What are the aims of the aggressor? What are the channels, media of the aggressor, and also the target? So the aggressor that has its aims and measures can use our inability to resist. And disinformation can promote labeling and bullying. When labels are pre-created for people on saying that left is doing this and that, and others say that, well, the fascists are coming and are ultranationalists. And we have those groups that are polarized. And in the young people, we should avoid that. And we should promote young people and enable them to see some positive things in their interlocutors and prevent them from labeling other people. If you see your interlocutor as your enemy or an adversary, you tend to close in your own bubble. I don't have a magical recipe for that, for conversation, but without trying to speak, you will not be able to communicate or answer the questions of the reasons for some choices. So before judging, we should try to understand. So judging and labeling and calling names is actually a challenge that we have to work on. During our discussion, algorithms of the social media was mentioned. And when we speak about communication, we should understand that we communicate with different worlds. People that are our neighbors can get different messages and information in the social media networks. And this actually impedes communication and strengthens polarization risks and miscommunication. Viktor, what do you think? Can we learn this ability to understand each other and avoid labeling? Or can we gain this experience with time only?
Well, it's very difficult to answer those questions. And social bubble is not something that we are pushed into. This is something that we create by ourselves. It's quite natural for social media to enable us to build this social bubble where I find it convenient to communicate with other like-minded, sharing the same values. Well, I myself am trying to avoid that, but that's the general algorithm, right? I try to eliminate from that social bubble of mine those that do not share my values or my opinions, people that I find it difficult to discuss with. So that's my convenient social bubble that I'm in. And we have to understand that we have a huge number of these social bubbles existing. Each of them shape itself on its own. Very often we tend to notice these social bubbles following, let's say, the elections. When in my social bubble, the participants of it tend to comment other groups of the electorate. So coming back to the question, is it possible to organize some kind of dialogue between the different social bubbles? I believe this represents a huge challenge because being able to listen to others means that people have to be able to go beyond themselves, which is not that easy to do. And very often when it comes to social bubbles, they are also often engaged in labeling. And social bubbles tend to position you in a, let's say, superior position compared to others, participants of other social bubbles. Thomas, let's move on to you. Since you're working in the military, you see this general context where social media tends to share particular social messages that align with certain tendencies. How do you think it is easy or not that easy to remove certain people from those social bubbles? Well, let me clarify. Monitoring social bubbles is not the task of the military. Otherwise, we would receive a lot of questions from our intelligence community. Yes, we do observe that information coming from the social bubbles, but we do not interfere with that. As for drawing some of the people from the social bubbles, that's not one of the functions of the state. We have to work with our society, because if the state fails to do that, the opponent will do that. Those who want to sow division, who wants to establish more of these social bubbles, so that, let's say, in this kind of discussion, we would have many diverging opinions. And let's say when decisions have to be made in the parliament, in the military, or in a circle of friends or a community, we would find it difficult to find an agreement among ourselves. And the opponent would find it convenient to use this kind of situation to its own end. And so there are many of these social bubbles, and me, as a father, for instance, I have to take care of my children as I'm taking care of their nutrition. Likewise, I have to take care of their involvement in these social bubbles. Education comes next, and this relates to our course books. Over the past 20 years, Putin was able to certify his soldiers, his troops, enabling to mobilize people in the current situation. As for our efforts, we are trying to ensure greater literacy among our children, improve their skills to identify disinformation, teach them history, and teach them certain understanding. So this is where we are investing into our future, that is through education. Then comes regulation. I'm not saying that the state is not involved in that, but I mean that I am fully aware of what the state is involved in, but by regulation, I mean the legal regulation, let's say the information of the public, which identifies the functions of the institutions in charge of the information of society. And these are the this is the legal regulation that ensures and enshrines certain functions of certain institutions. We cannot regulate everything. And we can see that from the experience of other countries. But this is an important aspect. And let's not forget the responsibility of a human being as a disseminator of information. If, let's say, we're using the Telegram, which is becoming more and more popular among ourselves, or let's say the Messenger, and we say, well, take a look at what I found there. So I'm the one who shares that information from those social networks, and first and foremost, I'm responsible for verifying or checking that information, whether or not it is correct, and for looking into the context of that information. So this is my responsibility for sharing that content. And when I'm sharing something on my Facebook profile, I have to inform others whether or not this is my opinion or somebody else's opinion. That's our responsibility. Well, I believe none of us would be sitting here today if everybody thought about what they're posting on their Facebook. So, Kristina, we've discussed the securities on protecting people from disinformation and keeping people properly informed. And very often we are forced to deal with this ultimate issue, whether or not to remove certain content. Fact checkers are certainly involved in verifying certain statements on social networks and addressing what is personal opinion and what is not. And they're constantly forced to deal with the backlash for interfering into personal opinion. So how much freedom do we have? how much balance do we want to see on social media, and what requires certain moderation? Thank you, Aistė. These are some quite difficult questions that you are raising that would require a lengthier discussion, but Thomas has put it rightly by finishing his remark on the point of personal responsibility and accountability. So this is not a matter of declarative statements, but rather personal responsibility and how we assume it. How should we empower everyone to assume this responsibility and feel the sense of responsibility whenever needed? It is very easy to hide behind anonymity or fake profiles, as opposed to saying something right into the eye. I believe that media literacy, however we refer to it, must be broader in content. Rather than focusing or limiting itself to the sources of social media or information. In other words, our relation with the technology or with the others on the other end of the communication, that we communicate with the help of communication technologies, is very important. And that's a challenge. We are aware how politicians are inviting people to engage in dialogue. We are aware of the invitations to take part in dialogue at the municipal level and how our people are unable to make their issues relevant at a higher level through the help of the media. And there are many other issues that are involved. And this is all connected to our resilience. And so everything goes back to our ability to see a human being behind all of that communication that we're dealing with. We should all be able to feel safe when getting involved in this communicative dialogue, because this is the point of disinformation, that is to individualize those who are involved in dialogue. Dialogue is something that is related to establishing a connection with somebody else on the other end of communication. When you establish this connection, you, as part to that dialogue, you feel important to the dialogue. And so then this monologue is transferred into dialogue. And I do agree with saying that young people have different experiences from the elder generation. They have their own relation with technological developments. We are more socially experienced, and through this dialogue among us, we will only enrich ourselves. This is also a challenge for the media, where the media has to address this need for dialogue, and it has to be more inclined to resort to communicative dialogue. Well, I think I will have to think about that following our debate as well. Donatas, media literacy is a topic that is truly close to my heart. In your opinion, does our education system focus enough on media literacy? Because a lot of information has engulfed us, and this came with the technological developments. So, what's about that? Well, slow institutions tend to respond slowly to the changes in life. I believe that schools should open up more, and not talking about the media literacy alone. Everything that is relevant for the people of today have to be addressed, be it life skills or other issues. On the other hand, I believe we're being too primitive when we refer to media literacy. Because we then primarily think of the protocols that are passed down to certain institutions, schools from the ministry. But as members of community, we should be the ones that raise certain issues. There is this misconception that the teachers are not free enough to discuss certain issues, but they are the ones who are able to raise certain debates on particular issues. Certainly, we can address disinformation and many other topics this way. We believe that the virtual world, the virtual reality will address certain issues, let's say through some kind of chat groups or signing of online petitions. Well, perhaps not in the case of Maidan when it was said that lives don't count. In general, we're talking about certain transformative society. Well, I like those online games very much when you are forced to become the enemy and be the one in charge of disinformation. Because that's when you can learn about the tactics to polarize, to incite disagreement, to learn how to hire a fake news disseminator. So even though you do not consider the outcomes, this is also a way of learning things. So educating society, I believe, is important.
Victor, so from your perspective, what should be changed within the curricula of media literacy? Do you have any recommendations? Well, it is very easy to give recommendations, but it is very difficult to implement them. Things that I've observed in 10 years, I can say that in Lithuania, we have a political will to integrate the media literacy into the general curricula, and it should be much wider than only deciphering disinformation. It should also include ethical issues. How can we morally act on social media, for example? In my opinion, this should be integrated into the school curriculum. And even if we ask politicians, they would agree with us that this should be done. What's the problem about that? But the problem is that there's a question, should we integrate media literacy into other subjects, or should we have a separate subject? I would propose a separate subject, but do we really have teachers of that subject? If we take a political decision, we have to train teachers for that, and we have to start training teachers next year, and in 4 years we would have the first teachers of this subject. Will those who study in this program choose teaching? Actually, no. It is easier said than done. NGOs are working quite actively with media literacy, but I see another problem. If there's a strong NGO in one region, then we see certain positive activities, and in other regions where such NGOs do not exist, there's no activities. I would like to remark I think that we're speaking about Russia, but we should also focus on some local gangs and local groups that need to be targeted on the regional level in Lithuania. I see a positive achievement. In 10 years, we have made a huge leap. We have seen a great involvement in media literacy activities. And in this space, I see people who are actively working in this area. But we have a lengthy history in that. Romas Sakadolskis, a former journalist of the Radio Free Europe, who brought this idea. He brought this idea to Lithuania. He educated journalists and media representatives. And he used to say that if we have quality media and we would have quality if we had quality media, we would have quality audience. I had the opportunity to have a conversation with Romas Sakadolskis. He was very much enthusiastic about the establishment of the study program on media literacy. In 2008, we had a crisis, an economic crisis, and media literacy program was just a pilot program, but there was no follow-up on that. But in some of us, this gave an understanding that it is really important, and it's not only NGOs, but media outlets also see the importance in that. They share their experience and look for ways and I think we should also mention that. We've mentioned NGOs on numerous occasions and their mission in educating the society in media literacy. Thomas, institutions also bear certain burden in educating the society. Do you see any gaps in that? And are there any best practices that we can take pride in? As a man in uniform, if I start speaking about gaps and disadvantages, I would be understood as a critic by politicians in suits. The armed forces, as the institution, we realized that we will not be able to approach the society if we write a certain document. We understood that the media is our tool, and public opinion needs to be formed through the media. We would give our information to the journalists and media. And first, there was no knowledge who was the author of that information, but there was an understanding that we need to focus on this topic. And we're facing the problem in any bubble from the Soviet times. We speak about the real situation in our kitchens, but in the public space, we tend to discuss different things. We have to approach those bubbles and confirm to those people that they are right, and this is a positive confirmation bias. We provide reports to the public. We will continue doing this. It shows that other institutions also do that. Different security institutions also provide reports to the public on the situation, and this is our task. We have the National Crisis Management Center as a new institution. This is a very positive step. We have a state institution that embraces all other state institutions and has a different power from that held by the armed forces. The armed forces do not have permission to do certain things, but we have a separate state institution that can engage in such activities, and there are some joint efforts, coordinated efforts that are being taken on that institutional level. Certainly, we cannot have an ideal situation, but the goal is clear: to have a coordinated activity in the area of state security and protection of state security. And I see this in a positive light too. And we also have some positive international activities. Our media, you are representatives of the media. We provide reports to you. Previously, we would provide our reports, but we had no fact checkers within media outlets, but now we do have them, and this is a fantastic step. Do you know what elves are? You've forgotten. The enemies of trolls, and the trolls were Russian bots and propagandists. Now, well, these were people which showed the initiative and were called elves, and this was a very positive step. And I think that we can always find the negative points. Do we have any remarks or questions from the audience? Oh, we do have one question. My question is, do you see any threats or digital threats from China? For example, a TikTok platform. Do we discuss this issue widely in Lithuania, or should this discussion be widened? I will start and colleagues will continue. There is a quite a large audience of TikTok consumers. About 50% of media consumers have TikTok, and this is quite a popular platform among young people. But bearing in mind the geopolitical challenges, so we have to be very careful here due to some information wars. I think that strategic information specialists are working on that. In one of our recent studies, we found that 27% of people consume TikTok, and this number is quite high compared to Telegram consumers. And Twitter, only 7%. TikTok is a Chinese platform. What is the threat that TikTok has? Well, I do not want to expand on that very much. some content which is provided for us is forming the opinion of our young people, and it is not very beneficial, and adversary states exploit that. How can this be regulated? The state has certain instruments which can be used for this purpose. The influence of China. Well, China has no awareness of Lithuania. China can raise its awareness on Lithuania through Russia only. All Soviet Russian old narratives about us came from China. It means that China did not resort to anything new. But we share our data with companies, and they understand our needs and our concerns and some sensibilities in communication. So the awareness is growing. But I do not believe that you can actually win over or conquer the state with the help of Telegram, TikTok, Facebook, X, or Twitter. There is a threat, but it is being under control, and we are following the situation. I will be brief. There is a very simple thing. Last Friday, the Romanian Constitutional Court declared null and void the first tour of presidential elections, because this first round of presidential elections was one of a candidate whose election campaign was based on TikTok, and Russian special services were behind that campaign. Investigation results showed that in the area of disinformation, it is thought that China is learning from Russia. And this is the only sphere where China is learning from Russia. Well, the opposition of narratives of values or economic welfare. Viktor spoke about Romania. I think that for educators, it is very important that you have to familiarize with all the media that young people use. If you take no interest in those platforms or in those spaces, you are not able to understand young people and their realities. Do we have any more questions? No more questions, but we still have 4 minutes. And to finalize our discussion,
Mes, aišku, ir dirbtinė
when it comes to future threats, which certainly concerns AI development, is there still room for dialogue? And in general, what would be your future forecast? Viktor, let's start from you. Well, I believe it is not a question of whether or not there are possibilities for such communication. I think we must ensure this dialogue, and we must find ways to have this dialogue and seek qualitative information space. I would fully support what Viktor has said and add that we should not leave the virtual space per se. Virtual reality will never replace dialogue. And the index for civic engagement or civic activeness probably could be limited not only to, let's say, use of public transportation by society or the image of common entrances to residential buildings or any other things, because these are very simple issues that we address through dialogue. But this is really needed. I fully support what my colleagues have said, and I would also like to add that the experiences from the recent pandemic, when we were forced to live in lockdowns and resort to social networks to maintain communication, has demonstrated that young people were the ones that suffered the most from the lockdown. And it also proved that resorting to life on social media alone was not healthy. So we must search for healthier spaces for dialogue, and this library, I believe, is a good space for dialogue to address human rights issues. The right to reliable information is one of human rights. By empowering each other, by empowering teachers, parents, younger generation in general, and the seniors, we can build a more resilient society, more willing to resort to dialogue. And dialogue can be this recipe which, much like the COVID vaccine, could help us to withstand the so-called virus of divide and conquer. I'll be very brief. Lithuania's freedom and independence is the answer. Those who try to sow division, or those that you feel that are sowing division, should be treated as a threat. Dialogue can only happen through empathy, which is the ability to sense others. Everybody might share different opinions, even those who share Russian propaganda, maybe they're not to be blamed for that. But if we're all working for the same goal, which is for the benefit of Lithuania, then everything will be okay. I'm grateful to all the participants of the debate for a dynamic debate. Let me just remind you that participants of the debate included Donatas Puslys, Kristina Juraitė, Viktor Denisenko, and Thomas. Thank you very much to all.